Good morning and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Bill Benson. I am the host of the museum's public program, First Person. Thank you for joining us. We are in our 17th year of the First Person program, and our first person today is Mr. Albert Garih, whom we shall meet shortly. This 2016 season of First Person is made possible by the generosity of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation with additional funding from the Arlene and Daniel Fisher Foundation. We are grateful for their sponsorship. First Person is a series of conversations with survivors of the Holocaust who share with us their first-hand accounts of their experience during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as volunteers here at this museum. Our program will continue twice weekly through mid-August. The museum's website at www.ushmm.org provides information about each of our upcoming first-person guests. The museum's web address is also in the program that you have today. Anyone interested in keeping in touch with the museum and its programs can complete the Stay Connected card that you will find in your program or speak with a museum representative at the back of the theater. In doing so, you will receive an electronic copy of Albert Garih's biography so that you can remember and share his testimony after you leave here today. Albert will share with us his first-person account of his experience during the Holocaust and as a survivor for about 45 minutes. If we have time toward the end of our program, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask Albert a few questions. The life stories of Holocaust survivors transcend the decades. What you are about to hear from Albert is one individual's account of the Holocaust. We have prepared a brief slide presentation to help with his introduction, and we begin with this school portrait of Albert Garih, which was taken in 1945. Albert's parents, Benjamin and Claire Garih, were born in Constantinople, Turkey, but moved to Paris in the 1920s. Albert and his twin brother, who died in infancy, were born June 24, 1938, in Paris, joining older siblings, Jacqueline and Gilbert. We see all three siblings, including Albert with his long hair, in this 1941 photograph. Albert's father worked in a garment factory, and the family lived in the janitor's apartment there. In May 1940, Germany invaded France and occupied Paris, which is identified by the arrow on this map. The Garih family fled south, but they soon returned to Paris, where they were subjected to France's new anti-Jewish legislation. In 1943, Albert's father was deported to a forced labor camp, and Albert's mother and the children went into hiding with Madame Galop and her husband for the next 6 months. When they returned home in 1944, police were sent to arrest the Garihs, but agreed to say instead that the family was not home if the family agreed to leave immediately. Albert was placed in a Catholic boarding school for boys and his sisters in one for girls in a northeastern suburb of Paris. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, Albert's mother was able to bring her children back to the city. Claire and her children are shown together in this photograph. Albert's father, released from the labor camp, walked from Belgium to Paris, returning to his family in September 1944 on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. The Garih family remained in France after the war. Albert received his baccalaureate degree in 1957, then earned a degree in English and Spanish to French translation from the School of Advanced Translation and Interpretation Studies at the Sorbonne in 1962, and immediately began his career in translation, which he continues to this day, 54 years later. His early work was translation of scientific and technical documents and publications, and later translation of political and economic documents. Albert's work took him from France to Cameroon and Africa, to Montreal, and then eventually to the United States. The organizations for which he worked included, among others, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the United Nations. His work with the World Bank brought him to Washington, D.C. in 1976. His current consulting work is for the United Nations. In 1967, Albert married Marcel Oayan, who had moved to France from Morocco in 1960. Albert and Marcel have 3 daughters, Judith, Dahlia, and Nomi. Their 3 daughters have given them 11 grandchildren, ages 21 years to 15 months. Albert describes himself as a real movie buff, enjoys photography, and loves to read, and he loves to travel. Albert and Marcel went to China in 2012 and visited South Africa in 2014. Last year, Albert traveled to France, a very significant trip for him that we will likely hear more about today. This past February, he traveled to India, where he spent almost 3 weeks touring the country. Albert speaks French, English, Spanish, and Judeo-Spanish. Albert volunteers here at the museum, speaking very often to classes of students from all over the country, sometimes by teleconference, in which he tells his story. And he sits at the donor's desk where visitors can visit him. And with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our first person, Mr. Albert Garih. Albert, welcome, and thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person today. And we have just a relatively short period, an hour, and a lot for you to share, so we'll start right away.
Sure.
World War II began in September 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The following May of 1940, Germany invaded France. You were nearly 2 years old at the time. Before we turn to the war years and what it meant for you and your family, tell us what you can about your family and their life before Germany invaded France, before the war began for you.
Yeah, well, my parents, as you said before, my parents were born in Constantinople, today Istanbul. They were Jewish, of course, and there was a Jewish community there, and it was fairly, life was fairly good, but they were a minority. So, Turkey was part of the Ottoman Empire. That was the center of the Ottoman Empire, which spans, most of the Middle East, what is today Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and even in North Africa. And but the Ottoman Empire had the bad idea during the First World War to side with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when they were defeated in 1918, in 1919 there was a conference in Versailles where the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. And when the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, the only thing that could be salvaged was Turkey itself. And then came a strong man by the name of Mustafa Kemal, also known as Atatürk, which means father of modern Turkey. And the Jews didn't feel quite comfortable. They were not sure what was in store for them. It was a nationalist movement, and the other side of a nationalism is very often xenophobia. So they were a bit afraid. Plus, they had seen the massacre of the Armenians at the beginning of the century. Then they had seen also the Greeks who were living in Turkey when Mustafa Kemal came to power in Turkey. They fled. They were living in Izmir, which is a port city on the Aegean Sea. And there was a very strong Greek community, and they fled. So the Jews, they maybe were next, and we don't know about that. So a lot of Jews at that time decided to emigrate. Mustafa Kemal came to power in 1923, and my parents emigrated in 1923 to Paris. My parents had been educated in Turkey in a school of Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a big organization, international organization, French, mostly French, that opened schools all over the Ottoman Empire, where education was given in French. So when my parents decided to emigrate, France was their natural destination. It was, all too easy. It was much easier to go to France than in any other country. Although my mother spoke a little bit of German also, but they certainly they were not interested in going to Germany. So anyway, they ended up in France. They both immigrated in 1923, but they didn't know each other. They met in Paris, and they married. They met in 27, they married in 28, and my sister Jacqueline was born in 1930. my sister Gilberte in 1933, and I was born with my twin brother in 1938.
Albert, you described to me your father as smart but a self-educated man. Say a little bit about him.
Yeah, my father, my parents were coming from very poor families. My mother was one of 7 siblings, and my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, died when my mother was 11. So it's my grandmother who raised her 7 children by herself. And that was not easy. And my father, it was about the same. My grandfather was a milkman. He was selling milk, and he was not making ends meet. So my father very soon, at the age of 10, started working. But he managed to go to school, to get an education, and his French was good. His French was perfect. They had an accent, a small. It was not like the Polish accent. It was different, and it was very nice actually. But they had this accent, but their French was absolutely perfect. And my mother, as soon as she came to France, she was able to get a job as a secretary in a small company actually. And the only thing, and there's an anecdote about that. At one point, she had to write a letter. The address was Boulevard Haussmann. Baron Haussmann was the one who modernized Paris in the 19th century. He built all these wide avenues and all that. And the spelling of Haussmann, which was a German name, was Haussman or MANN, I'm not sure. And my mother, the only Haussmann that she ever heard of, was a sultan by the name of Osman, O-S-M-A-N. So when she wrote the letter, she wrote Osman, O-S-M-A-N, and her colleagues made fun of her, and she was defended by her boss, who said, when you speak a foreign language the way she speaks French, you can make fun of her.
And in fact, your mom, by the standards of the time, she was well educated.
She got what they called at that time a brevet supérieur, which was more or less equivalent to the baccalaureate. Mm-hmm. And my mother was more educated than my father. Yeah.
So when your parents moved independently, met and married in Paris, they came from Turkey, they spoke fluent French, but what was their citizenship status?
Well, as soon as they immigrated from Turkey, they lost their Turkish citizenship, and they were stateless. They had in the 30s, they immigrated in 1923. In the 30s, they started the process of becoming naturalized with French citizenship. But at one point, for whatever reason, the French authorities froze all the application, and my parents remained stateless throughout the war. And it's only in 1948 that they got their passport. And the first thing that my father did, because he was always nostalgic, they suffered a little bit of, more than a little bit, about anti-Semitism even before the war. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in France. And my father had never experienced that in Turkey. In Turkey, which was a Muslim country, everybody was, they were also second-class citizens. There were some special regulations and some restrictions about them, but the population was not treating them like inferior or anything like that. In France, my father was a very proud man, and he resented the way that he was treated like less than nothing by some French people. So that was how they were. So they were stateless. And that means that had some consequences during the war.
It means essentially you have no country,
stateless. Stateless. They were stateless. They were living in France, almost like refugees, if you want. But they were not refugees. They had immigrated. They were immigrants. Mm-hmm. They were legal immigrants, but they had no French citizenship. They had lost their Turkish citizenship.
Albert, Germany invaded France in May of 1940. The war had begun in September 1939. but they invaded France in May 1940. And as the Germans advanced on Paris, there was a mass exodus of people fleeing Paris. Estimates are as high as 80% of the population left Paris. And you said to me that for your family, and this is a quote, it all began with the exodus from Paris. Tell us what that meant and about your family.
Yeah, when Paris was invaded in June 1940, actually there was a battle called the Battle of France, where the French army was defeated. Most of the soldiers were taken prisoner, actually, and the German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées. We have some video that show that, some clips now. So it's not only the Jews, but the whole population of Paris fled south, and it was total chaos on the streets, with cars, with bicycles, some people on foot, and
hundreds of thousands of people fleeing.
Yes, I don't know how many, but there were a lot of people, and they were also under the attacks of German and Italian Air Force. They were strafing them and bombing, and that's the first tragedy that befell my family was when my grandmother, an uncle, an aunt, and two cousins were killed under the strafing or a bomb, I don't know exactly, that fell on their car in Orléans, which is a city on the River Loire, actually. They were trying to cross to go south, and they were killed there. That was the first tragedy that struck our family.
Was that your mother's mother, your maternal grandmother?
Yes, it was my mother's mother, and so I have no recollection at all of her. I was 2 years old exactly during the Exodus. Mm-hmm. I was 2 years old. My mother told me that at one point we stopped on the River Loire in one of the chateaux. The River Loire is famous for its beautiful chateaux, Chambord, Chenonceau, which are jewels, really, crown jewels. We slept in one of the chateaux, but it was not anything, nothing luxurious. We were sleeping on the floor, and I was 2 years old, and my mother had nothing to feed me, and I was crying. And my mother told me at one point, all that I'm telling you now about this time is what my mother told me. From 1942 onwards, what I'm going to tell you is my own recollection. But from 1940 until 1942, it's what my mother told me. Mm-hmm. Okay? And my mother told me that at one point I was crying so much and I was disrupting everyone who was trying to sleep, that there was a soldier among the crowd there who had fled, who had managed not to be taken prisoner, who had a bottle of schnapps. And he gave my mother a schnapps, and he said, give him some schnapps that will calm him down. And apparently it worked.
So you found refuge in the villa. Was your father with you? Do you know if your father?
No, my father stayed behind.
He stayed behind.
My father, for whatever reason, I don't know. He wanted to keep his job. I don't know exactly for what reason. I know that I was with my mother and my sisters during that period.
Mm-hmm. And you would end up returning after a while, returning to Paris.
After a few days, I couldn't tell you whether it was a few days, a few weeks, but after some time, we had nowhere else to go. How long could we stay in the, as refugees in that chateau? Mm-hmm. I don't know. So we went back home. We had nobody to sponsor us outside, overseas. We had no relatives in the States or in Canada or in anywhere else, and we didn't have any money. Mm-hmm. So there was no way we could really go anywhere. So the only place for us was to go back home,
which was now it was an occupied city by the Germans.
Because in June 1940. When the Battle of France, when the French army was defeated in the Battle of France, the French government resigned and a new government was formed, which was a collaborationist government, which meant, under Maréchal Pétain, was a hero of the First World War. Actually, we're going to celebrate now the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Verdun in the First World War, And he was apparently the hero of that war, of that battle. The hero. He was known as the hero of Verdun, but in 1940 he became senile. He was in his 80s, and he turned coat and actually turned towards the German, and he was ready to collaborate. And he appointed a prime minister by the name of Pierre Laval, who was a definite anti-Semite and collaborationist, who went beyond the call of duty to help the Germans, at the expense of the Jews, of course. So there was a statute of the Jews that was edicted at that time that was patterned on the Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws were laws that were adopted in Germany, in Nuremberg. Almost every day there was a new law depriving the Jews of one of their basic rights. Lawyers were debarred, doctors were not allowed to practice medicine, teachers were kicked out of public schools, and there were all sorts of restrictions. We were not allowed in public transportation, for instance. So there were all sorts of restrictions. And we were living, my father was an accountant. He had learned accounting by himself, and he became an accountant, and he was doing the pay of he was working for a garment factory in a suburb of Paris, in Montrouge. That's where we lived. And the owner of that company was a Jew also, and he had allowed my father and our family to live in the janitor's apartment of the factory, so that we could save on the rent, I guess. So my father was juggling 2 jobs. He was working full-time, during the day in that factory doing the pay of the employees. And at night he would go to a movie theater on the Grand Boulevard, which was, an area in Paris, tearing tickets at the entrance, like you have today in today's cinemas. He was doing that to make some extra money for us, and we were not living in luxury, far from it. So we were living in that janitor's apartment, and in 1942, based on this statute of the Jews, the factory, since the owner of the factory was Jewish, the factory was confiscated. The owner had to flee. He went away, but he came back. Actually, he survived, but he went away. The factory was given to an Aryan manager, a non-Jewish manager, and one of the consequences is that we had to vacate the apartment, the janitor's apartment. That was in July 1942, and from then on, I remember everything. And what I'm going to tell you now is based on my own experience and my recollection of these facts.
In fact, Albert, I think what you said to me was that the Nazis really turned the screws on the Jews in 1942. That's when things really became infinitely worse.
Yeah, actually, the French had not waited for the Germans to turn the screw. They started already rounding up people in 1941 and sending them first to a transit camp in Drancy, which is a suburb north of Paris, and from there they would be sent directly to Auschwitz. But at that point, we had to vacate our apartment, and we had to find an apartment, and there was a big housing crisis. It was not easy to find a place, so we found something that was really minimal, with 2 rooms, not 2 bedrooms, 2 rooms, and a tiny kitchen, a toilet, no bathroom. So that was our apartment, and only the minimal comfort. We had running water, but not hot water. So, really basic things that we take today for granted. That was a luxury in those days. So we moved to that apartment, and I remember that vividly. I remember I was 4 years old. I remember I was impressed by the wallpapers on the wall. Things like that stay. When you're 4-year-old, there are just a few things, details like that stay with you.
You told me about an incident. I think it may have happened when you moved into that small apartment, but I'm not sure. involving when your mother handed you over a railing to somebody to hold you. Will you share that with us?
Oh, that was later, actually, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Actually, you have an exhibit on this floor called Somewhere Neighbours, Collaboration and Complicity in the Holocaust. When I saw that title, I thought it could not apply in a better way to my family. We were sandwiched between two families. One, a couple of communist people who were fighting the regime. He had been summoned to mandatory labor service in Germany. He had not reported for duty. On the other side, we had a militian, a collaborator, who was found dead in a movie theater after the war in retaliation. He had been gunned down by some people in retribution for his service to the Germans during the war. So that's, yeah.
Those are your neighbors. And
that was my neighbor. But the lady, the wife of this collaborator, did they know that we were Jewish? I don't think so. My sisters think that they might have known. They were friendly with us. And at one point, we were sharing a balcony. There was just a small railing between our part of the balcony and their part. And the lady invited me over. So my mother passed me over the railing to the lady there, and she invited me into her apartment. And she gave me something that I'd never seen before, and I still remember to this day, a yellow tomato. Everything was a luxury item in those days. An egg was a luxury item. So a tomato and a yellow tomato, I'd never seen that. That was wonderful.
Albert, the rounding up of Jews and their deportation eventually to Auschwitz really intensified in the summer of 1942. Yeah. In the fall of 1942, your parents sent you to a home in the suburbs. Tell us about that.
It was in 1942, yeah, that's right. Well, they had started to round up Jews and send them to camps. We didn't know about the camps. We didn't know about the gas chambers, about the crematoria and all that. But we knew that people who were sent east, it was not for their good. So we were terrified at this idea. And my parents were very concerned that that might happen to us. So they decided to send us, my sister and I, to a farm outside of Paris in a place called Thoiry, which is today is famous for a safari park. But in those days it was just farmland. It was, and we spent the winter of 42, 43 there. I remember that winter was very cold. There was a lot of snow. And it's funny because there are a few details that stay with. Mm-hmm. And I remember that that's the place where I heard for the first time the song "O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum, da 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 da," and that brings me back to that place,
Because that's where you heard it.
That's where I heard it, yes, and we sang it in French. It was not Tannenbaum, it was Mon Beau Sapin, but it was the same song. Yes, and my sisters would go to school. And I was staying with there was two ladies. The men probably had been taken prisoner with the French army. I don't know. I never saw any man in that farm. So I was staying with the ladies. And these ladies were raising pigs and rabbits. I remember that. And I was fascinated by the rabbits. I was playing with the rabbits all the time. They were in the small boxes there. And, I was very friendly with the ladies, and they were friendly with me. And one day in the conversation, my parents had not told the ladies that we were Jewish. They said just that they didn't have enough to feed us, and we would be better fed in a farm. So, and the ladies bought that. They took that at face value, and eventually. So one day in the conversation, I told the ladies that we were Jewish, and they panicked and they sent us right back to our parents. That was in the spring of 1943.
So you're back in that part with your parents?
Yes, with the constant danger of roundups. You know, in July 1942, exactly when we moved into that tiny apartment, that's when the biggest roundup of all took place. They were rounded up 13,000 people, including 4,000 children. Everybody was parked on a small stadium where there were bicycle races on a track. There, Veldiv.
The velodrome, right?
Velodrome d'hiver, yes, also known as Veldiv, you know, for short. And the people were there in terrible conditions because it was the summer of, it was July 1942, summer, it was hot. The people had been told to bring a minimum of personal effects with them. So they didn't have any food, they didn't have any water, it was hot, so they were thirsty. The children were running everywhere. And after a few days in that condition, eventually they were sent to transit camps, and from the transit camps they were sent to Auschwitz. And out of the 13,000, there were 4,000 children, and none of them came back from Auschwitz.
Albert, in September 1943, your father was taken for forced labor to the Channel Islands between England and France. Soon after, your mother, your sisters, and you went into hiding. Tell us what you can about your father being forced to go to the Channel Islands, and then about your mother finding a place for the rest of the family to hide.
Yeah, my mother was absolutely amazing. You know, she was desperate. She wanted to. She was so afraid that we might be taken away, and that was a real danger, actually. So she, you know, my mother was a very small lady. She was 5 foot tall, but she showed so much imagination, so much resourcefulness. She was desperate. She was fighting like a lion, protecting her cubs, you know, literally. And my father was taken away. He was sent to these Channel Islands. They were building what was called the Atlantic Wall, that was supposed to stop the invasion of the Allies into France, because the Germans expected the Allies to land somewhere in France, and from there to push towards Germany. So my father was, you know, in one of these islands. There were some camps there where there were about 900 inmates in his camp, and they were building bunkers and you know, these pillboxes from which the Germans were shooting at the Allies when they landed on the beaches also. So that was the idea. And my father had made a bad fall at that point. He was walking on a small scaffolding, and there was a loose board, and he stepped on the board. The board came to hit him right here, and he fell down a cliff. And he was losing his blood, and he was picked up by the soup truck. So, and eventually was sewn, and he survived. My father was very strong. I would not have survived half of what he went through, but he was very strong, and he survived.
As a little boy, do you remember your father leaving when he was forced to go for this labor?
Oh yes, I still remember. You know, we were living in a suburb, and usually to go to the metro. The metro was right at the gate of Paris, Porte d'Orléans. That's where that's where, when Paris was liberated, that's where they came into Paris, actually. And so that was a metro station. And usually we would take a bus to go from where we lived to that metro station. But that day we wanted to spend as much time as we could with my father, and it was about a 20-minute walk. So we walked all the way to the metro, and my father had this gas mask, because, you know, from the First World War, where they were using gas, they had been equipped, they had been given some gas masks just in case. And I was playing with that gas mask before he left. Actually, I was playing with it. I was putting it on. But anyway, I was 4 years old, you know. So he took his gas mask and we walked him all the way to the metro station. And I remember my mother was, of course, crying because she didn't know whether she would ever see her husband again. And we went back home after that, and my father took the metro.
And with your father gone, your mother would find a hiding place for you with Madame Galop. How did that come about?
She was desperate to find, she knew that it was very dangerous for us to stay home, because that's where, any moment, either the German boots would come down up the stairs and bang on the door and take us away, or it would be the French police. This big roundup that I was mentioning before, where 13,000 people were deported and killed, it was performed by 4,000 policemen, French policemen. It was the French police that was used for that dirty job, actually. Mm-hmm. So my mother was very concerned about that. And one day she met Madame Galop in a street market. She didn't know her, actually. But, in those days, somehow people have antennas, they could feel that she could open up to this lady, and she told her that she was terrified that at any moment they could come and take us away. And Madame Galop went back home and told her husband, and the next day her husband came with a cart, and we took whatever we could with us. We went to live with the Galop family. And the Galop family, that was the happiest time for me during that period. That was the happiest time that we had. The Galop family was absolutely adorable. Monsieur Galop was fun. He was always telling us story. He was building toys for us because there were no toys. So he was building, I remember he built us, I think for Christmas, some piggy banks. Like they looked like a small safe, It was, and he was very nice. He was telling us story. The only thing that was bad with the Galop, and it was not their fault, it was the food. The food was very scarce. We couldn't, we had to make do with whatever was available, and so it was not good. But other than that, and the Galop family had two daughters. I was in 43. I was 5, and their daughters were 4 and 3. So it was great playmates with me, for me. And Monsieur Galop was a sculptor. He was making sets for movie studios, and they had a big warehouse behind their house where all these sets were stored, and we had great hide-and-seek games in that warehouse with the two little girls. And they also had a small shelter right in the yard, and it was flimsy. If a bomb had fallen on our head, the shelter wouldn't have served any purpose. We would have been crushed. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's how we lived for about 6 months. And
the Galops did this at risk to themselves.
The Galop, to me, these people were absolutely heroic because, to take a Jewish family into hiding like that was very dangerous for them. They could have been deported. They could have been sent to a concentration camp, and their daughters with them, actually, and they had these 2 daughters. So these people, to me, it's beyond. Very often I ask myself, if I were in that situation, whether I would have that courage to do that. It's really something that is beyond imagination, actually. These people were absolutely phenomenal. And
in Albert, in the spring of 1944, however, your mother had to take the family from the Galop home. Tell us why that was, and then your mother being the lioness that she was, or you described, what did she do then? But first, why did you have to leave this home?
Well, we had to leave for a very good reason. The Galop family was living in a small street. There were about 10 houses in that street, and everybody knew everyone. And of course, when they saw this woman with 3 children living with the Galop family, they started some rumors, some people were wondering what we were there. And the Galop said that we were family from the countryside, which didn't make sense, because when people had family in the countryside, they would rather go to the family in the countryside than bring the people to their home. So it didn't make sense. So the people were not buying that argument. And among these houses were occupied by artists, sculptors, painters, and one of them, a painter, his wife was a sympathizer of the Germans. And one day she came to Madame Garih and said, "When are you going to get rid of that scum?" We were the scum. So at that point, Madame Garih and my mother thought it was, we had no choice, but we had to go home, and that's what we did. And
Went back to your apartment.
We went back to our apartment, and sure enough, a few weeks later, bang on the door, 8 o'clock in the morning, I was still in bed, 2 French police inspectors. Madame Garih, yes, we came to take you away. That was what my mother was dreading all along. She started shaking, and the inspectors, for whatever reason, it was more or less around the time of D-Day. So did they think that the war was over for them? They were losing? I don't know. Or maybe just a sense of humanity, they decided to let us go. They said, "We're going to report, we didn't find you, but you must not stay in your apartment. You have to find a place to go, another hiding place." It's not so easy to find a place like that, but they say you must not sleep in your bed tonight. That was how they put it. It was very blunt. They say, if we report that we didn't find you, they're going to send other people to put some seals on the door, and if they find you, they're going to take you away. So my mother, I was awakened by the commotion. I was still in bed. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. I was 6 years old, and I was not. My mother would not send me to school. She was afraid to send me to school because sometimes they would go to school. They would take the children, and the parents would never hear of them again. So there was that danger. My sisters, she had no choice, because they were older and the school was mandatory for them. So they could not stay home. They had to go to school. But for me, my mother would keep me home most of the time. Sometimes I would go to a kindergarten, but very occasionally. So she dressed me very quickly, and we went to see a social worker that she had been given the name, I guess. I don't know exactly how. She knew that social worker, and she explained the situation, and the social worker said, give me a few days. I cannot find a solution like that overnight. But in the meantime, try to see if you cannot sleep at your neighbors. And that's what we did. Mm-hmm. And my mother and I would sleep our next door neighbors, who were this communist couple. They had a young daughter, was about my age, and they were working on night shifts. She was working in a print shop, and he was working on wrought iron. I don't know exactly why, but they were working on night shifts. So we would sleep in their bed at night, and in the morning we would give them the bed. And my sisters stayed with the lodgekeeper downstairs. The lodgekeeper was a woman with 3 young children, 14, 12, and a little girl who was about 5 years old. And her husband had been taken prisoner. I never saw her husband either. So, and my sisters slept at the lodgekeeper's apartment, and we stayed like that for a few days until eventually the social worker came back to my mother and said, "Okay, I found a place for each one of you." And my mother was placed as a governess with a family near the Eiffel Tower. Actually, she was facing the Eiffel Tower. The family had 8 or 10 children. I don't remember the exact number. It was a big family. She was taking care of all these kids, and we were sent to a suburb northeast of Paris called Montfermeil, which was made famous by one of the episodes in in Les Misérables, actually. That's where Jean Valjean meets Cosette when she goes to pick up water, Montfermeil. And so we were in Catholic boarding schools. I was in a school for boys and my sisters in the school for girls. And we would meet every Sunday in church. Because, with the Catholic boarding schools, we would go to church every Sunday. And that's the only time that I was seeing my sisters. My mother, I didn't have any news about my mother. And you know what? At 6 years old, you get used to that. And I don't remember that it even bothered me that I was missing my mother or anything like that. My mother was out of the picture as far as I was concerned. I was 6 years old, that was it. And
what was it like for you to be in this Catholic school? What were the conditions? It was a boarding school, as you said.
Well, once again, the big problem was the food.
It was food.
The food was terrible, and it was so terrible that I got sick, actually, and I was not the only one, and I was very skinny.
And terrible because of terrible shortages of food.
Shortage, yeah. And the food we got was rotten. Mm-hmm. We had rotten beans, so I was sick all the time. And I lost a lot of weight. It was only about 3 months. It was the summer of 44. And, June 6, 1944 was D-Day when the Allies landed in Normandy. So, we were, nearing the end of that ordeal, but still we didn't have enough food, and the food was terrible. And I would meet my sisters in church, and the food was terrible. But I remember one day I had a feast. One day, the priest in that school was suffering from sort of cancer or something, at his stomach, and they managed to get a couple of potatoes for him and a piece of butter, and they made some mashed potatoes. But even that he couldn't swallow, so. Guess what? Who was fed the leftovers of the priest? Yours truly.
And you remember that. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And to this day, I still remember these mashed potatoes, and I love mashed potatoes too.
Albert, did they know you were Jewish children in these?
I guess there must have been someone in the school who took me in hiding, in that school. And I suspect that it must have been the headmistress, mm-hmm. because she was particularly good with me. She was always very protective. She was always taking my hands. I was just 6 years old. The children in that school were older. I think they started at 7 and up to 14. So I was really the youngest. And, it was the summer, so the school was very relaxed. We didn't have much classes, but we still had some classes. And I remember at that point, while we were with the Gallo family, my mother had taught me how to read and write already. So I knew how to read and write. I was 6 years old, but you had some children there who were probably not good students and who couldn't do that. And we were going in class, in the same class, in the same room. Each row was a different grade. So I was put with the babies, and I was doing strokes like that. And I remember that, and when I could already read and write actually, but I was still doing strokes like that. Anyway, so we stayed there, and I remember also from that period when there were some raids, some alerts. There was a bombardment coming up or something. We would go to the shelters, on the ground. And when the alert was over, the siren would blast again to announce the end of the raid. We would come out, and one of my favorite games, and apparently I shared that with Harry yesterday, was to pick up pieces of shrapnel in the playground. And I had a big collection of shrapnel that I brought home when my mother took me home, actually, which she very quickly disposed of. But But yes, that was one of my hobbies, was to collect shrapnel. And when it was, I remember one was about that big and it was jagged like that. And when you receive that in your body, it doesn't do any good actually. So yeah, that was one of our favorite games. 6 years old. What do you expect?
Albert, as you mentioned, D-Day was June 1944. Paris was liberated in August of 1944. You were 6. What do you recall or know about liberation and then about the reunification of your mother and your sisters and you?
What do I recall? Boy, I recall. I remember that like it was yesterday. Actually, we were in that school, and a kid, for whatever reason, it was, this boarding, you have two kinds of boarding schools in France. You have boarding schools which are very select and, where you put the children of the best families and where they get a very good education. And you have the boarding schools where people say, where their children are such bad students, they say, if you are not a good student, I'm going to put you in a boarding school. And that was the kind of boarding school where I was, actually. And one of the boys had run away the day before or something, and everybody was up in arms because it was the war, it was dangerous. And in the next morning, the boy came back and said, the Allies are coming, the Allies are coming. So I don't know whether he was punished or not, but all I remember is that we all went on the main street and we saw all the tanks, all the jeeps, all the soldiers with friendly faces, not with the German helmet, but with, the American helmet. And it was the first time I ever heard about Americans. I had never heard of Americans before. I knew everything about the Germans, the Italians, the Russians, the British, the French, the Americans. Who are these people? Where are they coming from? I had no idea. Needless to say that I was far from thinking that one day I would be one of them, but that's actually. So, yeah, and I remember these friendly faces giving us chewing gum, sugar, not sugar, chocolate, candy, even cigarettes. They were distributing cigarettes to people. So, and that's when we were liberated. And this memory is absolutely phenomenal. That's one of the best moments I had in my life when we saw all this. Because, somehow I was 6 years old and I must have felt that there was something wrong, in the way I was living. The fact that we were living, in hiding like that, it must have struck me at that point and say, that's it. This is taken off our chest. This is the end of our misery. This is the end of the threat. It was a liberation, really a liberation, And
you can only imagine what it felt like for your mom.
My mother, who was in Paris, she witnessed firsthand, She was, as I said, she was in an apartment facing the Eiffel Tower, actually. And they were fighting in the street, the Germans and the French resistance and the Allies. It was a French armored division who liberated Paris. It was a general by the name of General Leclerc, who became a hero and unfortunately died prematurely in a plane crash shortly after the war. And he was really a hero. He had taken an oath that he would liberate Paris and Strasbourg. I don't know why Strasbourg, but Strasbourg, because, it was Alsace-Lorraine, which were under German occupation. So he had taken an oath that he would liberate Paris and Strasbourg. So when the Allies landed in Normandy and they were moving east towards Germany, actually, General Leclerc asked for a special permission to Eisenhower to take his 2nd Armored Division, French soldiers, to liberate Paris. And Eisenhower acceded to his request, and that's how Paris was liberated by French soldiers.
And Albert, as you said, this huge relief, this was off your chest, all the stress, but you were still hungry and starving. What happened?
Well, you know, we were still the food, the restrictions lasted even after the war. Actually, it took a while before we could have a normal diet. Actually, but anyway, as soon as you know, we were liberated, we were east of Paris. So since the Allies were moving east, we were liberated a few days after Paris. So Paris had been liberated, and as soon as train service was restored, my mother was on the first train. She came to see us. And you know what? My sisters who came to, you know, our schools were not far from each other. And they came and they said, guess who's here? I had no clue. I didn't know. I didn't think at all about my mother. My mother was out of the picture as far as I was concerned, you know. Of course, when I pushed them, because I was curious to see who came to visit us, when I saw my mother, of course, I jumped into her arms. But and you know, we were so skinny and so starved that my mother had this ration ticket with which to buy bread, and you know, everything was on tickets, on ration tickets. She bought a loaf of bread that we swallowed in no time. You know, that's just how we were, and so she took us right back home. And meanwhile, my father, who was in these Channel Islands, he was west of the Normandy beaches, actually, and since the Germans had managed the Allies had managed to make the Germans believe that if there was a landing, it would take place in the Strait of Dover, which is the shortest distance between France and Britain. They were bombarding there all the time and destroying all the fortifications. So in May, 1 month before D-Day, all the inmates in the camp where my father was were transferred to the Strait of Dover, where they start repairing these fortifications under the fire of the RAF and the US Air Force and all that. And my father told me about one day there was, you know, when there was a bombardment like that, they had to lay flat on the ground with the strafing and, you know, everything. And he was laying on the ground next to a German soldiers. And when the raid was over, my father got up and the German soldiers stayed on, you know, he was killed. Oh, it was really dangerous. Mm-hmm. So then he was, tell us about your father coming home, because they were eventually evacuated and taken with the Germans. Yeah, when they were near the Belgian border, actually, at that point, you know, they were in the Straits of Dover, and at one point, the Germans were retreating, and they decided they put them on, they put all the 900 inmates on a train bound for Germany. Whether they were going to use them as slave labor in a factory or they were going to send them to a death camp, I have no idea. But anyway, the train was, you know, they were being shipped by train towards Germany, and the train was stopped in northern Belgium by Belgian resistance partisans who had blown up the railroad, and the train was stopped and there was a battle, and in the confusion the Germans released all the 900 inmates. And my father, somehow, I don't know how he made his way back to Paris. It took him about 2-3 weeks, and he arrived the morning of Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. And that morning of Rosh Hashanah was the first time my mother was dressing me to go to synagogue. The first time since before the war. Before the war, I was not going to synagogue. It was too small, but I mean, to me, it would have been the first time I would have gone to synagogue. And knock on the door, also at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was my father. And it took my mother a few seconds to recognize him. He was gaunt, and you know, we were living in an apartment building. There was a long corridor which was dark. When the light was not on, it was dark. And it took her a few seconds to realize that it was her husband who was there. So we were reunited, and so my nuclear family, my father, my mother, my sisters, and I, we survived. But as I said, my grandmother, an uncle, an aunt, and 2 cousins were killed during the Exodus, and my mother lost some cousins who were sent to the camps, never to be seen again.
Albert, I think we have time for a couple of questions from our audience. Can we do that?
Sure.
And what we're not going to have time to hear about, of course, is this is September 1944 when the families reunited, Paris is liberated, but the war would continue until May of 1945, and so they continued to live in warlike conditions and scarcities, and then, of course, had to establish a new life and begin over again, and eventually, as you know, the story that we told a little bit at the introduction, eventually Albert made it to the United States and began his family, and we don't have time for all that, but we have time for a couple of questions. We have, if you have a question, we ask that you wait till you get a microphone. There's one coming down either side of the aisle, I believe, and get the microphone, and then make your question as brief as you can. I'll repeat the question just to make sure everybody hears it, and then Albert will respond to it. So do we have any brave souls willing to? We have one gentleman right here ready to ask a question. There we go. The microphone's coming down to you.
Yes, I'm just very curious. Families like the Gallows, did you have a chance to reconnect with the children that were your age from
Yes,
the families that helped you?
The question is, did you have a chance to reconnect with families like the Gallows who had helped you? And I'm so glad you asked that because we didn't get to that question.
Yeah, actually, reconnect is the right word because we lost touch with them, actually, unfortunately. But in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I told my story to a friend who was living in Israel, and she said, "But have you ever tried to have these people recognized as righteous among the nations?" I said, "What is that? I had no idea about that program." So, and she told me, and she gave me the name of the person to contact to tell my story. And I had the Gallo family and the Ménétrier, the communist neighbors, recognized as righteous among the nations. And as I said, I had lost track of them, but I managed to find Madame Gallo back in 1990 or 91. I was in France, and I looked, we had a small computer type phone book in France called Minitel, and I looked in the Minitel and I found Madame Gallo, and I found her phone number. I called her. I said, "Are you the widow of Gabriel Gallo?" And yeah. I said, "Well, I'm Albert Garih." And I went, oh, she was so shocked and she was so surprised. I said, "Madame Gallo, it was the end of the year." I said, I cannot come now to see you, but I promise the next time I come to France, I will go to see you." And I went to France a few months later, and I flew. She was living in the south of France, in Montpellier. I flew there, and we were reunited, and it was a wonderful moment, actually. And she loved me like a son, actually, and I loved her like another mother to me. And last year, as I went back to France. I go to France about once a year, you know. And last year I had a chance to be reconnected not with Madame Gallo, because Madame Gallo, you know, the Gallo and the Ménétrier were recognized as righteous among the nations, but only Monsieur Ménétrier could attend the ceremony for the handing of the awarding of the Medal of the Righteous. Madame Gallo died a few months before the ceremony, but I was there for the ceremony in Montpellier, and I was reunited with two daughters. Unfortunately, in the past few years, both of them passed away, but last year I had a chance to be reunited with their children. So I met the granddaughters of the Gallo family last year, and they were eager to hear from me about how it was when we lived together with their grandparents. And I told them I was raving about their grandparents, because I said what they did is beyond the words. Actually, it's so.
Thank you. We're going to close the program now, but I know there's some other questions. It's our tradition at first person that our first person has the last word. So I'm going to turn back to Albert in a few moments to close the program. When he's done, he will stay up on the stage. So absolutely feel free to come up and ask him your question, or if you just want to get your photo taken with him or say hi, whatever. But Albert will stay behind to anybody who would like to visit with him. I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Remind you that we'll have a first-person program each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. So hope that if you're local, you can come back, and if you're not, you'll make another trip here. If not, look to the website for our program next year in the hope that you'll be back in Washington, D.C. And so on that note, Albert, thank you so much, and let's hear your last thought.
Yes, concluding remarks. You know, I thought about that, and this past Monday was Memorial Day. And we saw all these programs on PBS about, you know, the president going to lay a wreath on the monument of the unknown soldiers. And we saw all the cemetery in Arlington with all these white crosses and white stars of David, and you know, and I've seen that, and every year on that Memorial Day, I can't help thinking about these young men who came, who so many of them lost their lives for us to live in freedom, to rid us of the tyranny of the Nazis, and I always have a thought for these people, because I saw them firsthand when we were liberated. I saw these friendly faces, and I have a special connection with them. And so there, you know, if I want to conclude now, I would say that in my, you know, in all this horror that we went through, and the threat of worse, actually, I was blessed that there were so many people who were so willing to stick their neck out for us, whether it was the Gallo family, the Ménétrier, the headmistress of the school, the Catholic boarding school, all these people. I would have loved to have this headmistress recognized as a righteous among the nations. And I went back about 10 years ago. I went back to Montpellier, not to Montpellier, to Montfermeil, and I found the school. It's exactly the same as it was, except it was freshly painted. And as I said, it was the place Montfermeil where Jean Valjean met Cosette in Les Misérables. And to my big surprise, the school is now a seminary. Yeah, seminary, where they're training young missionaries, African missionaries who go back to Africa, and it's called Institut Jean Valjean. So, and but I wanted to do some research about the headmistress, but the people I saw, they were young secretaries. I had no clue. They had no idea about what I was talking about. They were much too young. And I didn't have much time. I didn't have enough time to pursue any research. I would have loved to have her recognized also as a righteous, because she deserved that.
Thank you, Albert.